Hey, and welcome to Pattern Niche on YouTube. This is a community-driven sewing channel where you're gonna find all kinds of fun and entertaining and helpful content to help you on your sewing journey. I'm Kate, and today we're going to be sewing the Niagara top and dress. Before we get started, I just wanted to encourage you to hit that subscribe button. It's totally free and it just means that we're gonna show up on your feed so that you don't miss any videos. Also, if you're enjoying this content, you can let us know by smashing that thumbs up symbol. So the Niagara is a fabulous scrap busting project, but it does have a few little maybe intimidating bits to it, which is exactly why I chose it for this sew along. Things like gathers, buttons and plackets, linings, and curved hems can be scary, but that's why I'm here. I'm here to tell you that anything is doable if you just break it down into little steps. After all, that's how you eat an elephant, isn't it? If you're still nervous about including all the tricky bits, you can omit things to suit your comfort level. For example, you can take out the placket and the buttons and then you would just have a regular straight bodice. If you didn't want to do a lining, you could add a neckband instead. Or to avoid the curved hem, you can simply straighten off that bottom pattern piece. Just make sure to measure it to the intended wearer's body so that you're not going to be making it too short. You might need to add some length. The pattern pieces have these little diagrams to show you where to cut. So if you're doing a sleeveless or sleeved bodice or a crew neck or a scoop neck, there's different options for the front as well as the back bodice and again those armholes. So make sure you are cutting on the appropriate lines, and it just makes it really handy to have one pattern piece for this instead of multiple. Really helps save paper and help our environment. Now let's make a Niagara. I'm not going to go into too much detail on taking measurements or grading or printing or using a projector because we have dedicated content to each of these topics, and they'll be linked throughout the video right up here and down in the description box. However, there are a few points worth mentioning. First off, and probably my favorite part of PDF patterns, is to utilize the layers function to isolate only the size or sizes that you're going to be using. This saves a crazy amount of time and frustration. Secondly, try to make your choices on options ahead of time to minimize printing. So for example, if you're doing a sleeveless, shirt length crew neck, you can omit a lot of printing pages just simply because you don't need things like the sleeve or the dress length or the plackets. Lastly, let's chat materials. This pattern was intended or made for knit fabrics with at least 25% stretch. The yardage will vary depending on the size you're making as well as the options you choose. Keep in mind that the lining does not have to be the same as the main fabric, and you could do some really fun color blocking here, making this a wonderful scrap buster. You're also going to need some interfacing. Now, a good rule of thumb on interfacing is to use something that matches the weight of the fabric that you're using. So for example, if you're using a nice lightweight jersey, you'll want a lightweight interfacing. And if you do choose to do the placket option, you're also going to need some buttons or snaps. Now with that all out of the way, let's move on to actually making the thing. So go ahead and prep your pattern, cut out all the pieces, cut out all the coordinating fabric pieces, and we'll get to constructing. Keep in mind that the bodice is lined, so you do need 2 pieces of the front bodice and 2 pieces of the back bodice or yoke. And also make sure to take note of and mark the notches and any other distinguishing markings on the pattern. And since the fronts and the backs are quite similar on this pattern, I find it useful to put a pin on the back pieces. I like to use blue for back, so I'll put a clip on the back bodice and on the back skirt as well. It just makes it a little bit easier to grab and know right away that that's the back instead of having to compare it to the other piece or to the pattern piece. So here's the pieces you'll need. 2 front bodice pieces, 2 back bodice pieces, 2 plackets, 3 pieces of interfacing, the back skirt, the front skirt, and the buttons or snaps. If you're not doing a placket, you won't need the 2 placket pieces or the 3 pieces of interfacing or the buttons or snaps. All right, let's focus on the bodice or the yoke pieces. We're going to take the outer main front piece and attach it to the outer main back piece at the shoulder seams, right sides together. I'm using my serger, but a zigzag stitch or lightning bolt stitch would work just as well. And then I like to press the seams to the back of the bodice. Repeat this process with the remaining front and back pieces or your lining pieces. If you are using the same fabric, you don't need to be too picky on which is the lining and which is the outer, unless there's a graphic or something that you really want to be showing on the front, or maybe a stain or something that you want to be on the inside. Next, we're going to attach the two units together along the neckline. So place one down right side up and the other one down right side down, so they are right sides together. Line up those shoulder seams, clip around to make it nice on the neckline, and then stitch it around. Lay it out flat and press it nice to finish. Okay, now the fun part. We are going to use the burrito method to sew the underarm seams. With your bodice lying open and flat, lining down and your main piece right side up, we're going to start rolling this all up. So take one long edge and start rolling it, go past the neckline until you're about an inch from the other long edge. Now you're going to take the bottom of the unrolled edge, so the lining, pull it under the roll and back over top to be right sides together with the main fabric piece. Stitch that together, and that's your burrito. Pull it right side out and repeat the process with the other side, rolling it up, matching those pieces together and stitching it down and pulling it out, and then press everything nice and flat. Time to construct the skirt, and the first thing to do is gather. Now this pattern has some really great notches for aligning everything, but if you want to go one step further, I like to mark the center of the bodice and the center of the skirt, and that just helps me to get some more even gathers. Now we're going to run 2 rows of basting stitches along the 2 notches on the back and the 2 outermost notches on the front. I like to put one inside the seam allowance and one outside the seam allowance for a really nice finish. So since our seam allowance is 3/8 of an inch, my one basting stitch is going to be at 1/4 inch and the other basting stitch is going to be at 1/2 inch. So they will be on either side of our seam allowance. I find this gives a really nice finish to the gathers. Now we just gather up those skirt pieces. For the front, we are only going to be gathering between the left section of notches and the right section of notches. Since we're doing a placket, we're going to leave that center area flat. If you are not doing a placket, you would gather the entire section. Stitch the skirt pieces right sides together down the side seams, and then do a tiny 3/8 of an inch hem on the armhole section. I'm using my cover stitch, but a zigzag stitch or a twin needle works just as well. Now I want to take a quick break to let you give this video a thumbs up if you're enjoying it. Doing so lets us know that you want to see more content just like this. You can also hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on future videos. It really does help our channel grow and evolve so we can bring you more entertaining content. The next step is to connect our pieces. With the bodice right side out and the skirt wrong side out or inside out, slide the bodice into the skirt right sides up, making sure that the raw edges are aligned around the top. You want to make sure the back is to the back and the front is to the front, and then match up all those notches and put a million clips in, making sure that your gathers are nice and even. Now I like to baste my gathers on first. This way I can check if there's anything getting tucked under that's not supposed to be, as opposed to if I were to just run it through the serger, and then, well, we all know how that goes. So do a basting stitch, get these attached together nice and secure, and then once they are, run it through your serger or do a more permanent stitch. At this point, it is not a circle, it is the back section and then the front section. So that is what it should look like. And then you're going to press those seam allowances down towards the hem of the skirt and just do a small tack stitch on each corner of the seam allowance just to kind of keep it down in the arm opening there. Okay, placket time. If you are not doing a placket, you can skip ahead. If you are not doing a placket, you can skip ahead to the hemming step and then you're done. But for those of us wanting the more Henley look, let's whip this up. Step 1 is to take one strip of that interfacing and fuse it down the center of the dress on the wrong side. Then we're going to draw a line from the center of the neckline down to our placket marking and cut it open. So fold your dress in half, finding the center of that neckline and then another center point a little ways down so we can have 2 points to make a nice straight line. Then you can use the skirt pattern piece to mark that placket end notch and draw your straight line down to there. And we are doing this on the back side of the fabric. Next, go to your sewing machine and perform a stay stitch along that line on the outsides 3/8 of an inch away on the two sides as well as the bottom. So it'll be kind of like a rectangle or a U. Next, we're going to slice it open. Yes, this is terrifying. Take your measuring tool and measure 1/2 inch up from that bottom placket mark. This is going to be where we stop cutting. So from the top of the neckline, cut down your line, your marked line, not your stitching, your marked line in the center, down to that new mark we just made. Then from that mark, cut diagonally into each of the corners, going right up to your stitching, but definitely do not cut through your stitch line. Set this aside for the time being, grab those 2 placket pieces and the remaining 2 pieces of interfacing. Fuse those 2 pieces of interfacing to the back of the 2 placket pieces, then fold the placket piece in half so that the long side is on top of the other long side. And then we're going to stitch down one short side of that, and we're going to repeat that on the other placket piece. Snip that folded corner point and then turn it out, and we'll have a nice crisp point there as well. I did also trim my seam allowance just for a little bit less bulk. And I did this on my sewing machine for a bit of a crisper finish. Again, when you're snipping, be careful not to snip through your stitching. Press this all nice and flat. Now let's attach these to the bodice. All right, so the next step is to take our placket pieces and lay them face down on the front of the bodice where we have cut the placket cut line. We're going to take the raw edge, not the folded edge, but the raw opening edge, and align it with one side of the bodice, having that folded seamed edge at the top by the neckline and the bottom open edge down towards the hem. We are going to align that at the top, clip it in place, and continue to clip, lining up these raw edges down the center cut line. And now what you can do is you can either sew from the back right over top of your stitch line that we did before, or from the front. We know that the seam allowance is 3/8 of an inch, so you can do that here. And you are not going to go past that bottom placket line. So it can be helpful to make the line on your placket piece as well. Now, I did want to say that up here, it's not going to follow this curve, and it's actually not supposed to, because it is going to end up getting flipped out like this, and we want it to just continue on nice and smoothly, not be curved up or wonky in the middle. So that's what we're going to do now, is stitch down this line here. And I used the lightning bolt stitch on my sewing machine, and then you're going to repeat this process with the second placket piece. So I have these stitched down now, but one thing I forgot to mention is when you are doing that, you want this inner seam from where the skirt attaches to the upper yoke or the bodice to be pointing down and stitch over it that way. So that is quite important for a nice clean finish. Flip the plackets open so that the seam allowance is to the inside, and also tuck in the bottom of that placket to the inside of the bodice. So I was just going to show you kind of a common problem that can happen with plackets is this puckering here at the corner. So this can happen if you sew too far past your placket line or too far away from that original stitch line, which is what happened here. So it's an easy fix, but you do want to fix it now. So you just have to unpick a little ways and then follow on that line. So that's why when you go to stitch this on in the first place, it is helpful to just follow that original stitch line rather than doing the seam allowance, because things can get shifted and that kind of thing. So I'm just going to fix that, and then we will come back and finish the placket. Align these plackets one on top of the other, and we want the one on the wearer's right side, so when we're looking at it from the front, it's the left side, to be on top. I'm just going to tuck that in neatly here, again checking just to make sure there's no serious puckering. And then we're going to align these nicely And what we want is we want this top placket to line up nicely along the bottom placket, but not to go past it. We do not want it coming past onto the main shirt piece. So we're just going to align it like that. And you can even pin it further down. We do have this seam here to match up. So pin it and match it as best you can. It's not that big of a deal right now because we're just gonna be focusing on the bottom. So now that we have that done, let's flip it to the inside. And we're going to flip the rest of the dress out of the way so that we just have, starting at the bottom, that little triangle from when we snipped to the corners. And then we have our front placket and our bottom placket. And we're going to lay those on top of one another, kind of making sure everything is smoothed out. And then we are going to stitch across that original stitch line again. Now you can grade the seam allowances on all three sides by trimming down the sections of seam allowance under the top section. So we want to leave the top one longer and then trim down the ones underneath it, and then you can finish the seam allowance to your desire. Press the plackets all nice and flat and top stitch around all three sides. You'll also notice that I did this extra square at the bottom of the placket. I just like this for added security and to kind of offset the button placement. Next is to just add your buttonholes and buttons. I highly recommend doing test buttonholes until you get things set perfectly. This is a step I used to skip all the time and I would majorly regret it all the time. You can see here with this first attempt how bad it went. Now imagine if I would have done that on my actual garment, how upset I would have been. It did take me a while to get things right. You want to make sure that you're practicing on something very similar or exactly the same as your main garment. So for me, I had to stick in a piece of interfacing and that made a huge difference. So once I finally did get things right, I was off to the races and I finished my 3 buttonholes and cut them open. And I chose these colorful little hearts for this project, and since they are shanks, I had to sew them on by hand. Normally, I use my sewing machine for buttons as well. Finally, hem your dress. There are a few different ways you can do a curved hem. I have a video for a hem facing on my own channel, which is super awesome and helpful for curved hems. But for this tutorial, I actually decided to just run a basting stitch at the hem allowance for me to use as a guide to flip it under and then press. So since it is a 3/4 inch hem allowance, I just set up my sewing machine at 3/4 of an inch, ran that basting stitch all the way along the edge, and then I knew that I would just fold it under at that point and press it. I just clipped it a lot and ran it through my cover stitch machine. Since this is such a gentle curve, I do recommend just taking your time, marking out the hem, folding it under and pressing carefully, and then using a ton of clips before stitching it through. If you don't have a cover stitch machine or a twin needle for your sewing machine, you can serge the raw edge ahead of time, and then when you go to stitch it down with a zigzag stitch, you'll have that nice finished look on the inside. Phew, and that's it! Admire your handiwork and enjoy your new piece of clothing. Thanks so much for watching, liking, commenting, and subscribing. It really does help us out. Bye till next time.